Hi everyone. We're just gonna give everyone time to just the stragglers to come on into the meeting. I am Kaya. I work for Clean Energy Fund of Texas, and then my co-partner here is Marina.
About 30 seconds, guys. We want to be respectful of your time and then we'll get started.
Well, I can see Tamara and James, two I can see. Hi, guys.
All right. Happy rainy Wednesday afternoon, everyone. My name is Marina. I'm one of the Energy Efficiency and Partnerships Officers here with Clean Energy Fund of Texas. For those of you who are new to who we are the first nonprofit green bank for the state. We do below market financing for energy efficiency and solar projects across Texas. The mission really is to get clean energy access to as many Texans as possible, regardless of credit, regardless of socioeconomic background. We want all our neighbors to have the energy efficient upgrades they need to make their home safe, healthy, and happy. So with that, I'd love to introduce Miss Patrice, aka Pete Parsons. She's the Executive Director of Texas Solar Energy Society, and I'm going to hand the mic over. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I can't see you all, but I know you're there. So we're just going to flip through this. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. I had right after 2021, after the storm, we had a lot of people in the state that had decided to install solar and storage. So that they didn't end up stranded again without any heat or cooling, primarily heat at that time. And so we had a whole bunch of companies that swooped into Texas that were solar sales groups. And there were a lot of them that were incredibly unscrupulous and horrible people. I mean, I even saw one training film about, it was kind of a rah, 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 like you're in the Marines, uh, talking about how to go get the people that are 55 and older. And it was just horrible. And as a result of that, we had a lot of people being scammed. The TDLR told me later that over the last 3 years, they've had over 1,000 complaints, and that the only other two groups out there that have had more were tow truck drivers and cosmetologists. No, that's not right. People who do hair. And so I went to them and I said, look, we've got this problem. How do we get some kind of licensing going for people who that want to do solar sales? We had a lot of installers that were also kind of, being awful, but it was primarily the sales organizations that were coming in. And so what would happen is an installer, particularly some of the larger installers, would contract with the company to do solar leads and not know what had actually been sold. And so, I mean, not that, bad on them, but still, it caused horrible problems in the state. Once the press picked it up, we started getting beat up, and it really made a difference in the industry. Sales went down. I personally decided that we needed to try to do something about it. In talking with TDLR, they told me we can't do anything until we get direction from the legislature. So in working with Zaffarini's office, as well as some of the other really wonderful organizations that do a lot of lobbying at the state, we were able to get a conversation started about the bill. We were able to get the bill passed. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are first. I should have done that a few minutes ago. We are a statewide nonprofit. We've been around for 50 years this year. And we're focused on the promotion and education around solar plus storage. So it's my job to do whatever I need to do in order to promote and protect the industry. Yeah, so we can flip through this slide. That basically just talked about what the bill was had been proposed and got passed. So if you look at what got passed, the TDLR formed a steering committee to help inform them on what needed to go into the rules. And I was invited to be part of the steering committee and, helped represent the industry. I wasn't the only voice. There were about 20 of us on the call, but I was the only industry person. That's not true. We had one other. He was an actual installer, and his name's Mark Bench, and he'd been working with SIA on some kind of solar sales training. And so he was invited to participate as well. So we had the steering committee meet. I can't tell you how many times we met. It was interesting. I got to know a lot of people, and I got to know a lot of different points of view. So we, once we went through and came up with what we felt like TDLR should adopt, that went out for public comment in March and just recently closed. And next steps include, they got the public comments back. The steering committee met again. We discussed, the larger comments. Most of the comments were just, in support. We had no comments that didn't support. And we then kind of haggled over a few things that's been left outstanding. And we can talk about that in a few minutes on how to get some things done in a way that's not going to be cumbersome for the installer, but still protects the consumer. We can talk about those in a minute as we come to them. But we basically came to agreement. Those rules will be given to their board, the commission's board, at their June meeting, and they will vote on the rules. They then become effective in September. So that's kind of the way it works. It also, states that they can't go beyond the legislation, which obviously makes sense. Okay, next slide. Next slide. So there are different components to the bill. One has to do with the actual license, which I'm going to go over first. There is a fee for it. And if you are an installer, which we call retailers, there is a registration fee. And if you're a salesperson, there's a registration fee for that. So you can work for an installer and not necessarily have to pay the $56. This is just if you're a solar salesperson, then you have to pay the $56. If you work for somebody, they can register you part of their $350 fee. So you also know that, the electrical contractors, they're exempt from solar registration, but they're subject to all other requirements in the bill. So there was some question about that. Their electrical contractors have their own license and their own set of rules, but if you're an electrical contractor, you still have to apply. The Senate Bill 1036 still applies to you in terms of the rules of 1036. If you're in violation of the rule, you won't be penalized for both. You'll be penalized for one. Rather than two licenses being penalized, you'll just be penalized for 1036 license rules. All right, so you do have to have liability in order to participate in this process. And, your general liability for your business can count. But this is the type of requirements you have to have in terms of liability, and it also must protect the consumer. So that's a little bit different than what the other liability insurance you've had to have. So, which is great because a lot of installers are, like I said, I call them solar decorations. They put up solar decorations and then they disappear. So this is a way for consumers to be protected from that kind of behavior. You have to have liability in the first place, and then if you somehow screw over the consumer, excuse my French, then your insurance has to cover that. Okay, next slide. All right, so the next slide talks about the actual contract. And there was a lot of debate about this particular section of the rule. How many days before a consumer, so a consumer can cancel the agreement, what language, if it has to be in writing. I mean, we went over and over all kinds of the different pieces to a contract. We all were supportive of having some kind of fill in the blank disclosure document that spells out, the highlights of the contract, what you're paying, how much it costs per kilowatt, what you're supposed to be getting back from the utility, who the license of the salesperson, the license of the installer, just make it really clear up front. It's got to be clear. It's got to be, easy to read. We're still working on how to distribute contracts in languages other than English. That's still being worked on, but we recognize that there are a lot of non-English speakers out there, but they feel like if they have to have somebody explain the contract to them anyway, that person probably speaks English. So there's just been a lot of debate about what to do about that piece. Next slide. Again, we had a lot of conversation about how many business days and what does that mean? I mean, because I don't think the government supports the date it was postmarked at the mailbox or at the post office, because sometimes that doesn't happen until 2 days later. And so there's been a lot of conversation about that, but it is assumed that it's 5 days after that you signed the contract. You have up to 5 business days from the date, from the date you signed the contract. So they're still trying to figure out if they want to make it be in writing, if you have to make a phone call, if it can happen over the internet. They're still struggling with that, but they're going to come up with something that they believe will work. There's also the fact that you have to repay any kind of refund. If you have to pay down any kind of money, you would get that as a refund. Let's see here. Cancellation and refund the sale lease if there's a violation. So if you sign if a installer signs a contract and they are in violation of the contract, then the consumer will get a refund on their money. However much money they paid is how much money they get back. If they pay $60,000, then they've got to be returned $60,000 plus any kind of roof damage or anything like that. So it's a full refund on your money. It goes without saying that the retailer has to be responsible for their salespeople. I mean, if you are a retailer, then you need to be sure your people are acting appropriately. Let's see here. Agreement for installation must give contractor info and utility approval if that's applicable. So, any kind of, if a utility in the state requires, some kind of approval before you start, or, if the city requires anything before they'll issue a permit, then they have to be in compliance with that. I'm not sure that there is any city like that, but it's covered. Next slide. Of course, it's obvious in terms of the installer that you have to be licensed. That's been a law for a long time, and that's nothing about that's changed. Let's see here. Obtain any permit. You know, for instance, if you're doing any kind of installation, you obviously have to get a permit from the city, unless you go with a third-party contractor. And you also have to follow any kind of, like, you know, utility rules, interconnection, anything like that. So if you're in violation of any of that, you can be, of course, if you don't get installation, I mean, interconnection, probably you're not going to have an active system anyway. But it's if you charge people for installation and you don't meet, you know, inspection, and you don't meet interconnection rules, then you can get your money back. Let's see here. They also can conduct any kind of background checks, or you know, if you are suspect, they're not going to do it with everyone, but I think that you know, particularly if you're working for a retailer, if you're a salesperson, you work for a retailer, and it has not been if it's been a rocky road, then they definitely were going to start doing some kind of criminal history check. They also, you know, they need to make, I mean, if in some instances, if it's particularly if you do a lot of business, it's not unreasonable to assume you're going to have one or two jobs where you've had a problem, or you're going to have one or two customers that are not completely satisfied. I got involved in a conversation with the consumer in Corpus, and he was very unhappy with the way a trench had been dug, and you know, I mean, he just wouldn't let some things go that were. It's not. I didn't understand why he was not happy, but the installer was doing his best to make that person happy. And so, you know, if there are reasonable efforts being made by the installer to make the consumer happy, then there's probably not going to be a lot of pushback from the state. The same is true with salespeople. If the installer and the salesperson makes a reasonable effort to correct the problem, then you're probably not going to get smacked. There are other things. For instance, you can't, if there's no solicitation sign and you are a door-to-door salesman and you break that rule, you'll be penalized. And you may not imply false affiliation with the government or a public utility. You have to provide registration information. So for instance, you have to provide your registration number. You have to provide evidence that the retailer has the required insurance. All of this is going to be required on the disclosure form. And you also have to get continuing education. We talked a lot about whether or not a salesperson in the first year should be required to have a license, and everybody decided that salespeople in the first year should have an opportunity to be trained by their, you know, whoever it is they're working for, and that the second year, I mean, they have to get a license, but the second year they're going to have to start continuing education. I didn't support that. I felt like they needed to have some education before they could even start. But I know for a fact that if you're going to try to get a sales license through NABCEP, you have to do so many hours of sales before you can even qualify for, you know, that certification. So there was a lot of conversation about it, and they just decided the first year you'd be off the hook, but starting the second year, and it will increase every year. The number of hours increases every year. So all that's going to get hammered out in terms of, you know, how many hours per year, what's the, you know, total number of hours, max, all that's going to be hammered out. We did not get that completely hammered out. They'll have that hammered out. Okay, next. So this is the, you know, the number in terms of dollars for violation. And you'll see here that if it's a person over 55, you're really going to get in trouble. This is primarily because a lot of these bad actors really went after the elderly and the disabled. And I can tell you that the sales pitch I watched, that's who they were targeting. And so if it happens to be a consumer that is over 55, then you will get a substantial violation for each and or aggregated number of violations. Okay, next. That's pretty straightforward. All right, this goes over kind of the highlights of the criminal conviction. Some of them are kind of no-brainers. Crimes involving deceit, fraud, blah, blah, blah. That is considered a crime, and they will go after you for it. Theft, burglary, racketeering, kidnapping, homicide, assault. The only one I didn't put up here is any kind of sexual aggravation, but these are all pretty obvious. The way it's going to work is, you're primarily going to get hit with dollar fines. But if any of this stuff is committed, they're going to go after you for criminal conviction. TDLR has their own department that does things like this. And this is kind of the first time that our agencies had any kind of teeth behind violating any kind of rule. And so it's kind of like, you got to be aware if you're going to perform this kind of stuff. This has to do with third-party lenders. And it basically says if you're a third-party lender, then, if the consumer cancels, then you got to cancel. And it also requires the solar retailer to pay any kind of outstanding balance of the loan in the event that a cancellation is ordered by the department or the commission. And that kind of sums it up. I'm willing to open this up to questions because, it's a lot of stuff. And if there are any questions about anything in particular, here is my contact information. Write it down, jot it down, particularly if you have clients that have been scammed. And I can help direct them to where they need to go in order to report it and or try to get some relief. And that's that. You want to open it up to questions?
Yes, we're going to open up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Pete.
You're welcome. See a lot of people I know on this call.
I have a question.
I have a question. So, for example, as far as tax is concerned, we are technically a third-party lender, and we already cancel a contract or loan docs if requested by the customer, as long as the funds have not been released to the installer. Would that still be the case? I mean,
Yes, that's the case.
okay.
I can tell you there's a lot of conversation about going back next session. And of course, I don't know if anybody's going to be able to get a legislator to pick it up because the finance companies are going to pitch a fit. But there is a lot of conversation about, requiring a lender to cancel the loan if the person has been frauded. So
Got it.
I'll give you an example. There were there was a solar installer that went out and sold a bunch of systems, knowing full well they were going to declare bankruptcy, and did not do the kind of job they felt like that in order to get the consumer their system energized and or working well. They went out, they declared bankruptcy, and the consumer was still on the hook for the loan. So there's a lot of conversation about what do we do in those kind of circumstances. So there's been some conversation about going back to the legislature and, basically tacking on to and or modifying these rules to include financial institutions, to be sure that the financial institutions do their due diligence. So I don't know what it looks like. I mean, it's certainly going to happen next session because everybody kind of wants to wait and see if there's anything else that needs to be tweaked or if that'll even get passed because financial institutions are going to like throw a fit. So, anyway, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you so much.
I think Roman had a question.
Yes, please feel free to raise your hand and follow up with your question.
Thank you for the
Chris?
presentation. Thank you for the slides. This has been very informational and very helpful. I wanted to go back to the part of the conversation where you were talking about the challenges with translating information for the consumer here. And I'd just like a little bit more detail or understanding of what the challenge is. Is it who bears the response? Like, is a challenge like who would be responsible for translating it, or kind of what's the technical challenge there? I just kind of understand is it the number of languages that a document would have to be translated to? Could you just help me understand, wrap my head around that a little more?
Yeah, sure. So the conversation generally, if you have a salesperson, let's say they're Spanish speaking, the salesperson will do the sale in Spanish, but then the documents they get are in English. And if they're non-English speakers, they're not going to know if what they just got sold is what they're actually getting or the details of the 50-page contract and so the question has been, how do we solve that problem? Particularly since we're talking about so many different languages in the state. If you're Vietnamese, then it should be in Vietnamese. But the conversation has been, well, if I'm a Spanish speaker and I don't speak English, and I ask my niece to translate it, she's probably going to be an English speaker. Well, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but I understand the difficulty for an installer. I mean, how many contracts does an installer have to have? Does he have to have one in English? Does he have to have one in Spanish? Does he have to have one in Vietnamese? I mean, it's like, that's a little unfair for the installer as well. So they're trying to figure out exactly how they want to do that. The other
I think we might have lost her for a second. Well, I think we might have lost Pete for a second. I'm gonna message her to see if she can rejoin. But just feel free to put your questions in the chat, and if she's not able to get to them today, we will send them over to her so she can definitely answer your questions after the session.
Hey, folks, it's Jane Pulaski. I have a question for Pete when she returns, or maybe Tamara. Assuming that updates about the legislation during the interim and meetings and those kinds of things will be either on the Texas website or in a newsletter or out on the social platforms, so folks can stay updated and know what's going on.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cruz Suarez, Obsolete Energy Solutions. I've been an installer in the field since 2014 and have actually collected a lot of data from multiple perspectives in the industry since 2014 and have been sitting from afar as a small business owner watching all these major companies come into our state from other states, New York, New Jersey, California, Alaska, and so forth, and have been witnessing first and foremost the bad acting in progress in a sense of a third party installer and seeing the the tactics that these sales guys utilize to bring in so many closed sales. And most of these major companies, they don't really care about a M2 payment. They only care about that first payment, the M1 payment. And so what I started realizing, and actually seeing last year what happened with Mosaic and this year with Freedom after what the Attorney General stated, kind of, I was able to start doing some research and I realized that, you know, there was no money for Freedom to do what they were doing. It was all like stealing from Paul to pay for Peter in a sense. And, they were never gonna worry about that second payment for a lot of those clients. And as an installer and showing up, being the actual face for most of these companies for almost a decade, and having to hear firsthand a lot of these elderly people, disabled people. And we were in Louisiana, and we had this 13-year-old kid answer the door, and I asked for his father. He says, "Well, I'm his what do they call it? The attorney, like he was legally like representing
Power
his."
of attorney.
Yeah, he was 13 years old and he was the dad's power of attorney. His dad was blind, and or it was, and he was immobile, like he was in a wheelchair. And I was doing a service call for a company out there, and they wanted me to pull a permit for them because our license is reciprocated out in Louisiana. And so when I showed up, I was like, man, this is crazy. I said, well, why ain't they pulling a permit? And it just kind of raised a lot of red flags. And seeing, all these things firsthand, I've had so many people cry to me in the sense that, they're still paying a bill, they're still paying the solar, and on top of that, they're still paying guys like me to come out and service these systems. So they're losing in three different ways. And for a very long time, I remember the reason we got into energy efficiency in 2008 was to save people money on their electric bill. So when I got introduced to PV in 2014, in theory, it was a no-brainer to join the industry and the movement. But through my years, I've seen so many different, like every year is a challenge in a way of a different experience with a different giant or a demon or wherever you want to call it in this industry. And just like on a small perspective, there's no way for the clients to determine who is really serious about the industry or who is just in it for the check, type of thing. And that's kind of what's been an issue with our industry is everybody saw the model and how fast it was to earn money, and they're doing the same thing with the detach and resets. And so I've been trying to figure a way to reach out to TDI and how to get a regulation on that, because so many people are touching these systems who aren't qualified, and then they just have access to capital and have ways to dress up 20, 30 guys and give them trucks and branding. And so now they're a company, whereas you have guys like me jumping through all these loopholes to get certified on all these different things, and it really doesn't even matter because we still don't get work because we're overshadowed by the big branding companies. So that's all I wanted to say.
Well, I know that I'm going to hop in. I'm so sorry, my computer just crashed. Um, I know that I'm not picking on roofers, but I know there are a lot of roofers out there that are coming in, particularly with hail damage. And, as they're redoing the roof, they are either selling solar or reattaching solar. And I've heard from a number of installers that a lot of them do not have any kind of licensing for, or don't have a mechanical engineer on site. I mean, an engineer on site. Electrical engineer on, is that the right word? Electrical engineer on site. So it's they're breaking the law. But or they're driving around and they're selling solar and they're not meeting the rules for licensing as a solar installer. So my advice is when you run across those guys, turn them in. We now have a way to go after them. We didn't have a way to go after them before. Now we do. So if you know of those companies, then my advice is there's going to be a way to reach out to TDLR and say, you need to look at these guys, and they'll go after them.